This is an unrehearsed program. The views expressed are those of the guests and not necessarily those of the producer. Today's topic.
Can we help Syria without making things worse in Passion for Truth?
Welcome to another edition of Passion for Truth. Horrors in Syria continue, but the opposition is not intimidated. According to Russia, the Security Council should not engage in domestic affairs of member states. So it raises an important question. As long as these countries are not united in their war against violence, could we anticipate more genocides in the future? And another question, are the Syrians going to appreciate the U.S. intervention? That's all we have in the next question. George Nestochek from management consulting firm Nestochek & Associates, also former staff director with the U.S. House of Representatives, Dr. Amarjeet Singh, director Voices for Freedom, also columnist for several newspapers, Ann Buwalda, director Jubilee Campaign and owner Just Law International, and Dr. Gregory Staunton, president Genocide Watch, also a professor at the George Mason University, formerly affiliated with the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars. Welcome you all.
Thank you.
Starting with you, George, do you think the UN resolution could have stopped the Syrian killing? And is it too late for diplomatic solutions?
I don't think the UN resolution would have stopped the killing. I think this is a question of Assad trying to survive, and he doesn't seem to be of any frame of mind to step aside peacefully. I don't know if the Libyan experience is coloring his thinking or not, but it looks to me like he's going to hang in there till the end. As far as the UN having any say at all over there, I just don't see that, quite honestly. It's a very tight neighborhood that Syria finds itself in. The relationships that Syria has established with its neighbors and more distant neighbors, Russia and China, are very tight and have been strong for years. So this is not something that you can undo overnight. And the hold that the regime has on the institutions of governance, with the military in particular, is so tight that I just don't see it ending in any kind of happy way anytime soon.
You think that, Dr. Singh, the U.S. and its European allies will think about another war in the Middle East without the UN cover?
I think, as mentioned earlier by Greg, the situation in Syria is much different than what it was in Libya, Egypt, or even Yemen for that reason. Too many players there. Turkey, on one hand, who controlled this whole Middle East until the First World War for almost 600 years under Ottoman Empire. Iran, which has vested interest through Hezbollah in Syria, and then Saudi Arabia, which is promoter of Wahhabi Islam, but in Syria the ruler Assad is from a minority Islamic sect, not the Sunni sect. So OIC is having its own agenda. European countries are looking at that some stability should be there. They don't want to create another Iraq there who should go in the ambit of Iran. But at the same time, unfortunately, what I am seeing is, in spite of what happens at UN, some resolution or not, we are going to see a lot of bloodshed in Syria in the coming days, coming weeks. The situation is not going to change immediately.
It's not going to change, a lot of bloodshed, you anticipate, Anne?
I would agree that the situation on the ground is going to continue to be more bloodshed, and I think that the reason that Russia and China vetoed the Security Council resolutions is their own interest in Syria. They view that a breakdown of Syria will indeed look like Iraq after post-Saddam Hussein, in terms of a breakdown of the clans and the fractionalism within the society. It's not a uniform society. You compare that to Egypt, which is way more uniform. You don't have ethnic and other enclave identities, whereas in Syria you do.
Speaking to Anne's point, will Russia and China continue to support genocides, tyranny in other countries as well?
Yes, they will.
I think the basic reason is this, that for both countries, for both Russia and for China, they still think in terms of sovereignty giving the state the right to do anything it wants with its own citizens. Whereas what could be called an emerging norm of international law is still not solidified, which is, so it's called the responsibility to protect, in which it essentially turns sovereignty on its head, and it says the first duty of every government is to protect the human rights of its citizens. And if its citizens instead are being attacked by that government, then to do something to stop it. I don't think China and Russia are there yet, and so I don't think that we're going to have an effective UN, just as George has said. The closest thing we got to it was to at least have a General Assembly resolution that went through by a huge majority.
But
so,
I also think you have to look at the relationship of both Russia and China with Syria. Russia has a naval base. Tartus is a naval base. It dates back to the old Soviet Union. Post-Soviet Union, it was in disrepair. A few years ago, they woke up and said, hey, we got a naval base over there, let's go assert some rights. So the first thing they did in January of this year is they took a flotilla of military vessels into their naval base in Syria.
And even
China has oil interests. Yeah. China's got significant interests as well, not to mention the sale of arms by both countries to Syria.
And even to see that how Putin is handling his own opponents as he's running for the election now, and those who are opposing, how the system is using various measures to curb those protests. So I think at this stand we have the track record of China, Tinemansker and others. So I don't think that, other than, as Anne mentioned, their business interests, their naval base and all others, even when it comes to democracy and rights of the people and basic human rights and all, Russia and China, usually they gang together in UN at different times.
I would agree, and I would point out, as Anne did, you know, this beefing up of this Russian naval base that's in Syria actually makes the whole situation far more difficult, because what would happen, for instance, if we tried to blockade some of the Syrian ports into which the arms are being shipped that are being used by the Assad regime? The Russians would simply say, no, you can't do that. We're going to get our fleet up. And so actually my view, and this is where I actually go back to my experience in Ukraine, where George and I worked, I think the most effective long-term strategy for the opposition in Syria is going to turn out to be nonviolent protest, nonviolent resistance. Somehow we have to break through the view that the Alawites have, this small minority group that rules Syria, that it's an all or none game. If they lose, they'll lose everything. We've got to somehow convince them that they won't lose everything.
The economic sanctions, George, is the bravery of the opposition too strong to negate the economic sanctions that we have on Syria? Would it eventually force the dictator to resign?
Oh, no. No, the economic sanctions have to be ascribed to unanimously by all the players. That's never going to happen. China and Russia themselves are going to have open pipelines of trade, if no other reason than their military presence in the military port would provide that opening. That's not going to happen. As far as dealing with the rest of the world, Syria is a relatively small country. It's not like they need markets all over the world to survive. So as long as they've got they serve as a client state to Russia and China, those two entities alone will keep them going. This is not going to be a very simple
And I think one of the key players in the Middle East, Israel, has not shown its cards yet, that which way it will go. And as Dr. Stanley pointed out, we are talking about Alawi, the main Assad's tribe which is ruling there. But even opposition is not unified. they have different sects and all, and we don't see that unity in the coming time. Even under non-violence, there is no way that under what heading, there is no way that they can come under one thing.
Yeah, I would add on the economic sanctions that Assad could very easily use those to starve out his opposition and blame the U.S. and the rest of the world for that outcome. So
the opposition, Greg, is in Syria is divided by region, and the politics and the regime's spies penetrate their movements to make it even worse. So what should the U.S. focus on countries like Russia and Iran that are providing military support to Assad?
Well, actually, I have come up with an idea that I don't know if it's crazy or what, but we have actually proposed, Genocide Watch, that the United States proposed to Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, that together the NATO countries that are in the region, particularly Turkey and some of the others, cooperate with the Russians to get assistance into some of these cities that are now bombarded, in which, you know, there are no medical supplies and so forth. In other words, basically really put the Russians on the spot on this. I have no idea if it would work, but what it would do at least is point out to them, look, there's a humanitarian disaster here, and you actually have the power to do something about it.
Will Russia buy that humanitarian crisis?
Not until Assad and Syria become a liability. Right now it's an asset to them geographically. It gives them bases in the Mediterranean, but not until they become a liability. And we've got to establish a strategy to make Assad basically a dead weight and an anchor around the neck of anyone that supports him. I'm not exactly sure how we would do that right now, but I would say rather than focusing on Russia and China, I'd focus on the neighbors. Of Assad murdering his own people can make them come around to where they could be the source of support, moral and physical support to the opposition inside Syria. Us intervening makes and we're an easy target to rally counter support around. I wouldn't do that.
You've got a very, very long border, you know, around Syria that includes a NATO country, namely Turkey. You've got Jordan, you know, which is an ally, really, in many ways. Iraq, which, you know, is also, I mean, they can't possibly really seal up this border. We can get in an awful lot of supplies to help out the people who are starving and who need medical assistance.
But why can't this medical or other relief be facilitated through International Red Cross or others? Why we like to bring Turkey in, particularly when it comes to that whole history? Yeah,
that would actually be better.
Yeah.
I would point out that the U.S. involvement in Egypt and giving aid, if you will, to those who were protesting in the streets did not ingratiate the population, the United States to the population. Less than 10% appreciate what we did to assist. I think the same thing is happening in Libya towards the West. And I think just, you know, the U.S. providing assistance in Syria will not necessarily mean the local populations will have any greater appreciation.
And raises a good point. The Syrians are not going to appreciate the U.S. intervention. We help Egyptians.
I think one positive thing has happened. Kofi Annan, the ex-Secretary General of UN, has been appointed as a representative to go to Syria and to negotiate. So maybe UN's card plus China wants to come to some kind of settlement. That may create a little bit that situation where some diplomacy may work, but at this stage the stakes are too high on all sides.
The caretaker government in Egypt is going to try 19 Americans who are accused of promoting democracy. Are the Syrians going to appreciate the U.S. intervention at all? We helped Egyptians and we got nowhere.
Yeah, I just don't see that. We're too easy to demonize by any opposition movement within Syria or within any Islamic country were very easy to demonize. So it wouldn't take much effort to organize demonstrations in the streets should there be a turnover of government to make sure that we don't get a foot in the door over there. So no, we would have to work through surrogates.
Particularly with the influence of Iran. We saw with the Iranian Revolution how they think about the United States, the support of Iran within Syria. Once again, the dynamics make it very unlikely that the U.S., any effort the United States would give to assist the opposition would actually be appreciated.
And I think in the Egypt's context, when it was a movement against Hosni Mubarak, like Coptic Christians in Egypt were together with the majority Muslims. But now after this change little bit, when the military has taken over or the elections have took place, even those Coptic Christians has been targeted, their churches, and also there is no one in control there actually. It has become a kind of mobocracy, not a democracy. It's mob which is deciding.
We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we are going to talk about, even if we are going to stop the bloodshed, will our intervention help? Stay with us, Passion for Truth. And Greg, even if we are able to intervene, it may not help if Syria does not remain an intact state. Will Syria be able to police its borders and stop terrorism?
Well, first of all, I don't think we should intervene. The reason, I think we've learned some things, frankly, from our war in Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean, the way we handled the so-called intervention in Libya was essentially from the air and from intelligence and so forth. We let the Libyans do their own fighting. I think that is the way to go in Syria. It's got to come from inside Syria, I think. And so if they perceive it as our intervention, it is going to fail. So I really don't think that our intervention is a good idea. But we can at least provide a lot of, food, medical supplies, non-lethal weapon type things like flak jackets, that kind of stuff can be done.
I think the breakdown of, again, the society within Iraq would be compounded in Syria. These maps that Professor Staunton has shows the dynamics within the country of all of the different enclaves. I go back to Syria is a patchwork of enclaves and different ethnic and even religious minorities, Yazidis, Christians, Shias, Druze, and so forth. Those minority communities are quivering in fear. I know that from sources that we have within the Christian communities within Syria. They've also experienced violence by the opposition against their communities, against their churches, including the abducting of women into forced conversion or death. So to say that the opposition is somehow completely innocent would also be a wrong statement.
The opposition is, George, battling the regime without central coordination, and is that a great flaw?
I'm sorry, is that a what?
Without the central coordination.
Yeah.
Is it a great flaw?
Oh, well, I'm not sure it's a flaw. I mean, that's just the reality of the country. If they were highly centralized, perhaps they might make a more attractive target to cut the head off the opposition. So there might not be a flaw, it might be a strategic advantage under the circumstances. But the opposition, that's kind of a very loose term in Syria. I'm not sure we know who they are, and I'm not sure we would want to align with any one particular segment of it or another. I'm not sure how one might even approach the decision-making behind that. So it's a complicated situation. Syria has been around for thousands of years. It's not a new country. You have to factor that in. There's a pride of I won't say nationality, but certainly of being a Syrian, given its long history. Any incursion from an outside source, even if it's well intended, would not be well received.
I think the international community in general and U.S. policymakers in particular, firstly should focus on humanitarian aid, as hundreds have died or are dying every day. The figure goes to 5,000 plus, as are the previous figures. And our first focus should be to have our feet on the ground to help the needy people. So I think on that we should bring it may be NATO, it may be OIC, it may be other neighboring countries on board. And first focus should be on humanitarian aid. The other can wait, as at this stage neither direct intervention nor any other diplomatic thing is working, and the only solution lies firstly to have some sort of contact at the ground level in the name of humanitarian aid as well.
I certainly take my guidance from the neighbors. You know, people that have lived there for centuries are border Syria and choose not to get involved despite the bloodshed, despite their own histories and sympathies. They're not getting involved. I think that should be a heck of a red flag for us to step there very, very cautiously, and I would say at arm's length at the very least.
Even if we intervene on humanitarian matters, as you pointed out, Moscow and Iran could get even more attached to the Syrian dictator once they find the humanitarian aid is coming from the U.S. or its allies.
Certainly they would, and I think another point should be drawn into this. The opposition is against Assad is localized in one area or region of Syria. It's not countrywide. In one sense, you don't have a countrywide opposition to President Assad. So the situation that you have there is that any aid given to one particular opposition by the United States government will align us with that opposition, but to perhaps again, the negative impact of that from the rest and the remainder of the country. So humanitarian aid, of course, we need to help those who are in need, but any kind of alignment, I think, would be hugely detrimental, both to our relationships with the Soviet Union, or with Russia, with China, and certainly would be detrimental to the remainder of the country of Syria.
How much credence do you give it to the fact that Russia is probably upset over the popular uprisings, fearing itself to be the victim of U.S. intervention one day because of its own bad records of human rights abuses?
Yeah, we can certainly cite the Chechens most recently. They have a long history of abuses of people living on their territory. Yes.
Muslims also.
Yes, a long history. Whether they fear an intervention from us internally, I'm not sure. You know, delving into that psyche is not something I choose to spend a lot of time on these days. But because of their past history and their view of authoritarian rule on territory, they can easily live with an Assad or anybody else. In the face of brutality, the past history of the Russians going back several centuries, they've practiced that kind of authoritarianism on their own people. So, no, I wouldn't look to that. I wouldn't look to any kind of reset button. There has to be a liability for them to step away from one of their client states. More of a loss than a gain, and I'm not exactly sure what that equation looks like today.
What complicates is that Syria remains an important customer for Russian arms sales, and as long as that relation exists, we probably no amount of intervention is going to solve the problem.
Yeah, and it certainly lends a lot of support to our Second Amendment here. Our founding fathers realized that those kinds of situations can occur, which is why they put the Second Amendment into the Constitution. If that population were armed as we are, I'm not sure Assad would treat them as flagrantly as he currently does.
Greg, even if Assad were to leave today for whatever magical intervention, don't you think he's going to leave a legacy of failed state because the opposition is already divided?
it's going to be a very difficult state to rebuild, no question at all. But that's actually one reason why I am in favor of a nonviolent resistance movement being gradually built in Syria, because I think it will help to unite a resistance movement. As we've pointed out, as Ann especially has pointed out, I mean, in Syria you have such a complex social and ethnic matrix with religious groups and so forth. You've got Kurdish people, you have the Alawites, you have Christians, you have the Yazidis, you have the Druze. I mean, but if you can bring people together, and then you, of course, the majority are the Sunni Muslims, and even there you have a number of different linguistic groups. So what I'm saying is basically, I think that only very patient development of a nonviolent resistance is going to avoid a failed state.
We will be back with our closing comments. Stay with us. Passion for Truth. Okay, what if the U.S. and its allies build the Syrian opposition a little stronger? If the opposition is strong militarily and united, could it stand up to the dictators? Yes or no, please, starting with you, Greg.
I do believe it could. In fact, I worry a lot that the violence is getting worse because of the organization of the Free Syrian Army.
I'd like to make the comparison with Libya. Libya's opposition is no longer united. It's fractionalizing. And I again go back to my concern. If Syria does not maintain a strong centralized government structure without Assad, the country is going to devolve into a bloodbath of enclaves and communities fighting each other.
It'll be a larger version of Lebanon.
I think change will certainly come, but after a lot of more bloodshed. But certainly change will be there.
You have the last word, George.
There might well be change, but I don't know what it would be changing into without some kind of infrastructure building of sense of community and political will and empowerment. You're just going to have a fractured, failed state.
And that's all the time we have. We'll bring you another edition of Passion for Truth next Saturday and Sunday. Thank you for joining us. Thank you all.
Talk to see.
If you have any question, comment, or suggestion on this program, please send us an email at mschawla@hotmail.com or write to us at 1011 Sod Meadow Lane, McLean, Virginia 22101. You can also access these TV programs and the radio programs archived on the internet at your own time on the internet at our page www.passionfortruthtv.com. Please watch these TV programs every week at the same station and at the same time, and send your comments to mschawla@hotmail.com.